Howdy, this is Alan Silver broadcasting from our studios here in Lemont, and this is on the I Have Celestial web TV and our continuing close encounters with Alan Silver and Timothy Leary. So today I decided to bring his text up, the Psychedelic Experience, in which he published this based on his Tibetan Book of the Dead as a kind of manual in setting up the psychedelic experience and this particular period of his career. I myself used the Tibetan Book of the Dead in my own experience of psychedelic drugs and discovered by using that book, it did turn on into the rebirth experience, which I experienced inside my mind, I assume, but I experienced that with inside the context of the experiment. So the Tibetan Book of the Dead is primarily a Buddhist doctrine on the life between life and death, and in the recycled life or reincarnated life, animated life. All those things have to do with the person's transfer from a physical plane to a energy plane and returned into a biological creature, which we call a biological creature is someone has a DNA code. That's what we say now in 2016. Anybody who has a DNA code is considered a human being. Human being. So that's what the Tibetan book isn't generally about. It's about people dying and so having a Buddhist read you that text why you're in death. The Tibetan experience is like 49 days that the body transfers into a new body. So those rituals were taken into the psychedelic experience. And me as an artist, this became when I prepared for a trip, like with certain type of music that you might choose. And you have to calculate how long you want to be in this particular state. A lot of people are confused in the early days about why Timothy Leary put such a great emphasis on set and setting, and I really respected that as a science artist. He was a psychiatry in science, and I'm an artist in science. So how I can explore my inner mind was interesting because those became source of my images, or how I could visualize music. And that's why when you I have to put this now in play with the new technology that we have at the present moment that Timothy didn't have during those days. What you call a visualization experience now that we're in 2016. So we're upgrading this text, which we will broadcast for you. And let's put it in context for what it is and how it relates to the relationship between. Now we have this technology that's able to do these kind of images that you see on my left. This is a musical program that iMac has, which is a iTunes visualizer. And this is very interesting way this responds to music now, and with the context of what kind of trips that we took and the data that we could transfer. We couldn't transfer our visual data to anybody, actually. When you look at people trying to say, what did you see? And you say, well, I saw a lot of different things. And you dig? So the experience itself could never really be transferred to any human being. But us artists try to visualize this trip. And now we have this kind of technology that you see on my left, and my work, especially here. So just give me this text, and I hope that you enjoy it.
The Psychedelic Experience 8 Manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead by Timothy Leary, Ph.D., Ralph Metzner, Ph.D., and M. Richard Alpert, Ph.D. The authors were engaged in a program of experiments with LSD and other psychedelic drugs at Harvard University, until sensational national publicity, unfairly concentrating on student interest in the drugs, led to the suspension of the experiments. Since then, the authors have continued their work without academic auspices. This version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is dedicated to Aldous Huxley, July 26, 1894, November 22, 1963, with profound admiration and gratitude. If you started in the wrong way, I said in answer to the investigators' questions, everything that happened would be a proof of the conspiracy against you. It would all be self-validating. You couldn't draw a breath without knowing it was part of the plot. So you think you know where madness lies? My answer was a convinced and heartfelt yes. And you couldn't control it? No, I couldn't control it. If one began with fear and hate as the major premise, one would have to go on the conclusion. Would you be able, my wife asked, to fix your attention on what the Tibetan Book of the Dead calls the clear light? I was doubtful. Would it keep the evil away if you could hold it? Or would you not be able to hold it? I considered the question for some time. Perhaps, I answered at last, perhaps I could, but only if there were somebody there to tell me about the clear light. One couldn't do it by oneself. That's the point, I suppose, of the Tibetan ritual. Somebody sitting there all the time and telling you what's what. Doors of Perception, 5758 I. General Introduction. A psychedelic experience is a journey to new realms of consciousness. The scope and content of the experience is limitless, but its characteristic features are the transcendence of verbal concepts, of space-time dimensions, and of the ego or identity. Such experiences of enlarged consciousness can occur in a variety of ways. Sensory deprivation, yoga exercises, disciplined meditation, religious or aesthetic ecstasies, or spontaneously. Most recently they have become available to anyone through the ingestion of psychedelic drugs such as LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, 1 etc. This is the statement of an ideal, not an actual situation. In 1964, the psychedelic drugs are in the United States classified as experimental drugs. That is, they are not available on a prescription basis, but only to qualified investigators. The Federal Food and Drug Administration has defined qualified investigators to mean psychiatrists working in a mental hospital setting, whose research is sponsored by either state or federal agencies. Of course, the drug dose does not produce the transcendent experience. It merely acts as a chemical key. It opens the mind, frees the nerve system of its ordinary patterns and structures. The nature of the experience depends almost entirely on set and setting. The preparation of the individual, including his personality structure and his mood at the time. Setting is physical. The weather, the room's atmosphere, social, feelings of persons present towards one another, and cultural, prevailing views as to what is real. It is for this reason that manuals or guidebooks are necessary. Their purpose is to enable a person to understand the new realities of the expanded consciousness, to serve as roadmaps for new interior territories which modern science has made accessible. Different explorers draw different maps. Other manuals are to be written based on different models: scientific, aesthetic, therapeutic. The Tibetan model, on which this manual is based, is designed to teach the person to direct and control awareness in such a way as to reach that level of understanding variously called liberation, illumination, or enlightenment. If the manual is read several times before a session is attempted, and if a trusted person is there to remind and refresh the memory of the voyager during the experience, the consciousness will be freed from the games which comprise personality and from positive-negative hallucinations which often accompany states of expanded awareness. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was called in its own language the Bardo, which means liberation by hearing on the after-death plane. The book stresses over and over that the free consciousness has only to hear and remember the teachings in order to be liberated. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is ostensibly a book describing the experiences to be expected at the moment of death, during an intermediate phase lasting 49, 7 times 7 days, and during rebirth into another bodily frame. This, however, is merely the esoteric framework which the Tibetan Buddhists use to cloak their mystical teachings. The language and symbolism of death rituals of Bomism, the traditional pre-Buddhist Tibetan religion, were skillfully blended with Buddhist conceptions. The esoteric meaning, as it has been interpreted in this manual, is that it is death and rebirth that is described, not of the body. Lama Govinda indicates this clearly in his introduction when he writes, "It is a book for the living as well as the dying." The book's esoteric meaning is often concealed beneath many layers of symbolism. It was not intended for general reading. It was designed to be understood only by one who is to be initiated personally by a guru into the Buddhist mystical doctrines, into the pre-mortem-death-rebirth experience. These doctrines have been kept a closely guarded secret for many centuries, for fear that naive or careless application would do harm. In translating such an esoteric text, therefore, there are 2 steps: 1, the rendering of the original text into English, and 2, the practical interpretation of the text for its uses. In his practical interpretation for use in the psychedelic drug session, we are in a sense breaking with the tradition of secrecy and thus contravening the teachings of the Lama Gurus. However, the step is justified on the grounds that the manual will not be understood by anyone who has not had a consciousness-expanding experience, and that there are signs that the Lamas themselves, after their recent diaspora, wish to make their teachings available to a wider public. Following the Tibetan model then, we distinguish 3 phases of the psychedelic experience. The first period, Chikhi Bardo, is that of complete transcendence. Beyond words, beyond space-time, beyond self. There are no visions, no sense of self, no thoughts. There are only pure awareness and ecstatic freedom from all game and biological involvements. Games are behavioral sequences defined by roles, rules, rituals, goals, strategies, values, language, characteristic space-time locations and characteristic patterns of movement. Any behavior not having these 9 features is non-game. This includes physiological reflexes, spontaneous play, and transcendent awareness. The second lengthy period involves self, or external game reality, Chanya Bardo, in sharp exquisite clarity or in the form of hallucinations, karmic apparitions. The final period, Siddha Bardo, involves the return to routine game reality and the self. For most persons the second, aesthetic or hallucinatory stage is the longest. For the initiated the first stage of illumination lasts longer. For the unprepared, the heavy game players, those who anxiously cling to their egos, And for those who take the drug in a non-supportive setting, the struggle to regain reality begins early and usually lasts to the end of their session. Words like these are static, whereas the psychedelic experience is fluid and ever-changing. Typically the subject's consciousness flicks in and out of these three levels with rapid oscillations. One purpose of this manual is to enable the person to regain the transcendence of the first Bardo and to avoid prolonged entrapments in hallucinatory or ego-dominated game patterns. The basic trusts and beliefs. You must be ready to accept the possibility that there is a limitless range of awareness for which we now have no words. That awareness can expand beyond range of your ego, yourself, your familiar identity, beyond everything you have learned, beyond your notions of space and time, beyond the differences which usually separate people from each other and from the world around them. You must remember that throughout human history, millions have made this voyage. A few, whom we call mystics, saints or Buddhists, have made this experience and/or and have communicated it to their fellow men. You must remember, too, that the experience is safe. At the very worst, you will end up the same person who entered the experience, and that all of the dangers which you have feared are unnecessary productions of your mind. Whether you experience heaven or hell, remember that it is your mind which creates them. Avoid grasping the one or fleeing the other. Avoid imposing the ego game on the experience. You must try to maintain faith and trust in the potentiality of your own brain and the billion-year-old life process. With your ego left behind you, the brain can't go wrong. Try to keep the memory of a trusted friend or respected person whose name can serve as a guide and protection. Trust your divinity, trust your brain, trust your companions. Whenever in doubt, turn off your mind, relax, float downstream. After reading this guide, the prepared person should be able, at the very beginning of his experience, to move directly to a state of non-game ecstasy and deep revelation. But if you are not well prepared, or if there's game distraction around you, you will find yourself dropping back. If this happens, then the instructions in Part 4 should help you regain and maintain liberation. Liberation in this context does not necessarily imply, especially in the case of the average person, the liberation of nirvana, but chiefly a liberation of the life flux from the ego, in such a manner as will afford the greatest three possible consciousness and consequent happy rebirth. Yet for the very experienced and very highly efficient person, the same esoteric process of transference. Readers interested in a more detailed discussion of the process of transference are referred to Tibetan Yoga and Secret Doctrines, edited by W. Y. Evans-Wentz, Oxford University Press, 1958. Can be, according to the Lama Gurus, so employed as to prevent any break in the flow of the stream of consciousness, from the moment of the ego loss to the moment of a conscious rebirth, 8 hours later. Judging from the translation made by the late Lama Kazhu Dawa Samdup, of an old Tibetan manuscript containing practical directions for ego loss states, the ability to maintain a non-game ecstasy throughout the entire experience is possessed only by persons trained in mental concentration, or one-pointedness of mind, to such a high degree of proficiency as to be able to control all the mental functions and to shut out the distractions of the outside world. Evans-Wentz, p. 86. Note 2. This manual is divided into 4 parts. The first part is introductory. The second is a step-by-step description of a psychedelic experience based directly on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The third part contains practical suggestions on how to prepare for and conduct a psychedelic session. The fourth part contains instructive passages adapted from the Bardo Thodo, which may be read to the voyager during this session, to facilitate the movement of consciousness. In the remainder of this introductory section, we review 3 commentaries on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, published with the Evans-Wentz edition. These are the introduction by Evans-Wentz himself, the distinguished translator-editor of 4 treatises on Tibetan mysticism, the commentary by Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst, and by Lama Govinda, and initiate of one of the principal Buddhist orders of Tibet. A tribute to W.Y. Evans-Wentz, Dr. Evans-Wentz, who literally sat at the feet of a Tibetan Lama for years in order to acquire his wisdom, not only displays a deeply sympathetic interest in those esoteric doctrines so characteristic of the genius of the East, but likewise possesses the rare faculty of making them more or less intelligible to the layman. Quoted from a book review in Anthropology on the back of the Oxford University Press edition of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. W.Y. Evans-Wentz is a great scholar who devoted his mature years to the role of bridge and shuttle between Tibet and the West, like an RNA molecule activating the latter with a coded message of. No greater tribute could be paid to the work of this academic liberator than to base our psychedelic manual upon his insights and to quote directly his comments on the message of this book. The message is that the art of dying is quite as important as the art of living, or of coming into birth, of which it is the complement and summation, that the future of being is dependent, perhaps entirely, upon a rightly controlled death, as the second part of this volume, setting forth the art of reincarnating, emphasizes. The art of dying, as indicated by the death rite associated with initiation into the mysteries of antiquity, and referred to by Apuleius, the Platonic philosopher, himself an initiate, and by many other illustrious initiate, and as the Egyptian Book of the Dead suggests, appears to have been far better known to the ancient peoples inhabiting the Mediterranean countries than it is now by their descendants in Europe and the Americas. To those who had passed through the secret experiencing of pre-mortem for death, right dying is initiation, conferring, as does the initiatory death rite, the power to control consciously the process of death and regeneration. Evans-Wentz, P. X3XIV, the Oxford scholar, like his great predecessor of the 11th century, Marpa, the translator, who rendered Indian Buddhist texts into Tibetan, thereby preserving them from extinction, saw the vital importance of these doctrines and made them accessible to many. The secret is no longer hidden. The art of dying is quite as important as the art of living. A tribute to Carl G. Jung. Psychology is the systematic attempt to describe and explain man's behavior, both conscious and non-conscious. The scope of study is broad, covering the infinite variety of human activity and experience, and it is long. Tracing back through the history of the individual, through the history of his ancestors, back through the evolutionary vicissitudes and triumphs which have determined the current status of the species. Most difficult of all, the scope of psychology is complex, dealing as it does with processes which are ever-changing. Little wonder that psychologists, in the face of such complexity, escape into specialization and parochial narrowness. A psychology is based on the available data and the psychologist's ability and willingness to utilize them. The behaviorism and experimentalism of 20th century Western psychology is so narrow as to be mostly trivial. Consciousness is eliminated from the field of inquiry. Social application and social meaning are largely neglected. A curious ritualism is enacted by a priesthood rapidly growing in power and numbers. Eastern psychology, by contrast, offers us a long history of detailed observation and systematization of the range of human consciousness, along with an enormous literature of practical methods for controlling and changing consciousness. Western intellectuals tend to dismiss Oriental psychology. The theories of consciousness are seen as occult and mystical. The methods of investigating consciousness change, such as meditation, yoga, monastic retreat, and sensory deprivation, and are seen as alien to scientific investigation. And most damning of all in the eyes of the European scholar, is the alleged disregard of Eastern psychologies for the practical, behavioral and social aspects of life. Such criticism betrays limited concepts and the inability to deal with the available historical data on a meaningful level. The psychologies of the East have always found practical application in the running of the state, in the running of daily life and family. A wealth of guides and handbooks exists. The Book of Tao, the Analects of Confucius, the Gita, the I Ching, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, to mention only the best known. Eastern psychology can be judged in terms of the use of available evidence. The scholars and observers of China, Tibet, and India went as far as their data allowed them. They lacked the findings of modern science, and so their metaphors seem vague and poetic. Yet this does not negate their value. Indeed, Eastern philosophic theories dating back 4,000 years adapt readily to the most recent discoveries of nuclear physics, biochemistry, genetics, and astronomy. A major task of any present-day psychology, Eastern or Western, is to construct a frame of reference large enough to incorporate the recent findings of the energy sciences into a revised picture of man. Judged against the criterion of the use of available fact, the greatest psychologists of our century are William James and Carl Jung. To properly compare Jung with Sigmund Freud, we must look at the available data which each man appropriated for his explorations. For Freud, it was Darwin, classical thermodynamics, the Old Testament, Renaissance cultural history, and most important, the close overheated atmosphere of the Jewish. The broader scope of Jung's reference materials assures that his theories will find a greater congeniality with recent developments in the energy sciences and the evolutionary sciences. Both of these men avoided the narrow paths of behaviorism and experimentalism. Both fought to preserve experience and consciousness as an area of scientific research. Both kept open to the advance of scientific theory, and both refused to shut off Eastern scholarship from consideration. Jung used for his source of data that most fertile source, the internal. He recognized the rich meaning of the Eastern message. He reacted to that great Rorschach ink blot, the Tao Te Ching. He wrote perceptive brilliant forewords to the I Ching, to the secret of the golden flower, and struggled with the meaning of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. For years, ever since it was first published, the Bardo has been my constant companion, and to it I owe not only many stimulating ideas and discoveries, but also many fundamental insights. Its philosophy contains the quintessence of Buddhist psychological criticism, and, as such, one can truly say that it is of an unexampled superiority. The Bardo is in the highest degree psychological in its outlook, but, with us, philosophy and theology are still in the medieval, pre-psychological stage where only the assertions are listened to, explained, defended, criticized and disputed, while the authority that makes them has, by general consent, been deposed as outside the scope of discussion. Metaphysical assertions, however, are statements of the psyche, and are therefore psychological. To the Western mind, which compensates its well-known feelings of resentment by a slavish regard for rational explanations, this obvious truth seems all too obvious, or else it is seen as an inadmissible negation of metaphysical truth. Whenever the Westerner hears the word psychological, it always sounds to him like only psychological. Jung draws upon Oriental conceptions of consciousness to broaden the concept of projection. Not only the wrathful but also the peaceful deities are conceived as samsaric projections of the human psyche, an idea that seems all too obvious to the enlightened European, because it reminds him of his own banal simplifications. But though the European can easily explain away these deities as projections, he would be quite incapable of positing them at the same time as real. The Bardo can do that, because, in certain of its most essential metaphysical premises, it has the enlightened as well as the unenlightened European at a disadvantage. The ever-present, unspoken assumption of the Bardo is the anti-nominal character of all metaphysical assertions, and also the idea of the qualitative difference of the various levels of consciousness and of the metaphysical realities conditioned by them. The background of this unusual book is not the niggardly European, either-or, but a magnificently affirmative, both-and. The statement may appear objectionable to the Western philosopher, for the West loves clarity and unambiguity. Consequently, one philosopher clings to the position, God is, while another clings equally fervently to the negation, God is not. Jung clearly sees the power and breadth of the Tibetan model, but occasionally he fails to grasp its meaning and application. Jung, too, was limited, as we all are, to the social models of his tribe. He was a psychoanalyst, the father of a school. Psychotherapy and psychiatric diagnosis were the two applications which came most naturally to him. Jung misses the central concept of the Tibetan Book. This is not, Lama Govinda reminds us, a book of the dead. It is a book of the dying, which is to say a book of the living. It is a book of life and how to live. The concept of actual physical death was an exoteric facade adopted to fit the prejudices of the Buddhist tradition in Tibet. Far from being an embalmer's guide, the manual is a detailed account of how to lose the ego, how to break out of personality into new realms of consciousness, and how to avoid the involuntary limiting processes of the ego, how to make the consciousness expansion experience endure in subsequent daily life. Jung struggles with this point. He comes close but never quite clinches it. He had nothing in his conceptual framework which could make practical sense out of the ego loss experience. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the Bardo, is a book of instructions for the dead and dying. Like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it is meant to be a guide for the dead man during the period of his Bardo existence. In this quote, Jung settles for the exoteric and misses the esoteric. In a later quote, it seems to come closer. The instruction given in the Bardo serves to recall to the dead man the experience of his initiation in the teachings of his guru, for the instruction is, at bottom, nothing less than an initiation of the dead into the Bardo life, just as the initiation of the living was a preparation for the beyond. Such was the case, at least, with all the mystery cults in ancient civilizations from the time of the Egyptian and Eleusinian mysteries. In the initiation of the living, however, this beyond is not a world beyond death, but a reversal of the mind's intentions and outlook, a psychological beyond, or, in Christian terms, a redemption from the trammels of the world and of sin. Redemption is a separation and deliverance from an earlier condition of darkness and unconsciousness, and leads to a condition of illumination and releasedness, to victory and transcendence over everything given. Thus far the Bardo is, as Dr. Evans-Wentz also feels, an initiation process whose purpose it is to restore to the soul the divinity it lost at birth. In still another passage Jung continues the struggle but misses again, nor is the psychological use we make of it, the Tibetan Book, anything but a secondary intention, though one that is possibly sanctioned by Lamai's custom. The real purpose of this singular book is the attempt, which must seem very strange to the educated European of the 20th century, to enlighten the dead on their journey through the regions of the Bardo. The Catholic Church is the only place in the world of the white man where any provision is made for the souls of the departed. In the summary of Lama Govinda's comments which follow we shall see that the Tibetan commentator, freed from the European concepts of Jung, moves directly to the esoteric and practical meaning of the Tibetan Book. In his autobiography, written in 1960, Jung commits himself wholly to the inner vision and to the wisdom and superior reality of internal perceptions. In 1938, when his Tibetan commentary was written, he was moving in this direction but cautiously and with the ambivalent reservations of the psychiatrist cum mystic. The dead man must desperately resist the dictates of reason, as we understand it, and give up the supremacy of egohood, regarded by reason as sacrosanct. What this means in practice is complete capitulation to the 7 objective powers of the psyche, with all that this entails. A kind of symbological death, corresponding to the judgment of the dead in the Sutta Bardo. It means the end of all conscious, rational, morally responsible conduct of life, and a voluntary surrender to what the Bardo Thodol calls karmic illusion. Karmic illusion springs from belief in a visionary world of an extremely irrational nature, which neither accords with nor derives from our rational judgments, but is the exclusive product of uninhibited imagination. It is sheer dream or fantasy, and every well-meaning person will instantly caution us against it, nor indeed can one see at first sight what is the difference between fantasies of this kind and the phantasmagoria of a lunatic. Very often only a slight abasement to niveau mental is needed to unleash this world of illusion. The terror and darkness of this moment has its equivalent in the experiences described in the opening sections of the Sutta Bardo. But the contents of this Bardo also reveal the archetypes, the karmic images which appear first in their terrifying form. The Jamyut state is equivalent to a deliberately induced psychosis. The transition, then, from the Sutta state to the Jamyut state is a dangerous reversal of the aims and intentions of the conscious mind. It is a sacrifice of the ego's stability and to surrender it to the extreme uncertainty of what must seem like a chaotic riot of phantasmal forms. When Freud coined the phrase that the ego was the true seat of anxiety, he was giving voice to a very true and profound intuition. Fear of self-sacrifice lurks deep in every ego, and this fear is often only the precariously controlled demand of the unconscious forces to burst out in full strength. No one who strives for selfhood in individuation is spared this dangerous passage, for that which is feared also belongs to the wholeness of the self, the subhuman, or suprahuman, world of psychic dominance from which the ego originally emancipated itself with enormous effort, and then only partially, for the sake of a more or less illusory freedom. This liberation is certainly a very necessary and very heroic undertaking, but it represents nothing final. It is merely the creation of a subject who, in order to find fulfillment, has still to be confronted by an object. This, at first sight, would appear to be the world, which is swelled out with projections for that very purpose. Here we seek and find our difficulties, here we seek and find our enemy, here we seek and find what is dear and precious to us, and it is comforting to know that all evil and all good is to be found out there, in the visible object, where it can be conquered, punished, destroyed, or enjoyed. But nature herself does not allow this paradisal state of innocence to continue forever. There are, and always have been, those who cannot help but see that the world and its experiences are in the nature of a symbol, and that it really reflects something that lies hidden in the subject himself in his own transsubjective reality. It is from this profound intuition, according to LeMay's doctrine, that the Jamyut state derives its true meaning, which is why the Jamyut Bardo is entitled the Bardo of the Experiencing of Reality. The reality experienced in the Jamyut state is, as the last section of the corresponding Bardo teaches, the reality of thought. The thought forms appear as realities. Fantasy takes on real form, and the terrifying dream evoked by karma and played out by the unconscious dominance begins. Jung would not have been surprised by professional and institutional antagonism to psychedelics. He closes his Tibetan commentary with a poignant political aside. The Bardo Thodol began by being a closed book, and so it has remained, no matter what kind of commentaries may be written upon it. for it is a book that will only open itself to spiritual understanding, and this is a capacity which no man is born with, but which he can only acquire through special training and special experience. It is good that such to all intents and purposes useless books exist. They are meant for those queer folk who no longer set much store by the uses, aims, and meaning of present-day civilization, to provide special training for the special experience provided by psychedelic materials is the purpose of this version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a tribute to Lama Grika Govinda. In the preceding section, the point was made that Eastern philosophy and psychology, poetic, indeterministic, experiential, inward-looking, vaguely evolutionary, open-ended, is more easily adapted to the findings of modern science than the syllogistic, certain, experimental, externalizing logic of Western psychology. The latter imitates the irrelevant rituals of the energy sciences, but ignores the data of physics and genetics, the meanings and implications. Even Carl Jung, the most penetrating of the Western psychologists, failed to understand the basic philosophy of the Bardo. Quite in contrast are the comments on the Tibetan manual by Lama Grika Govinda. His opening statement at first glance would cause a Judeo-Christian psychologist to snort in impatience, but a close look at these phrases reveals that they are the poetic statement of the genetic situation as currently described by biochemists and DNA researchers. It may be argued that nobody can talk about death with authority who has not died, and since nobody, apparently, has ever returned from death, how can anybody know what death is or what happens after it? The Tibetan will answer, there is not one person, indeed, not one living being, that has not returned from death. In fact, we all have died many deaths before we came into this incarnation, and what we call birth is merely the reverse side of death, like one of the two sides of a coin, or like a door which we call entrance from outside and exit from inside the room. The Lama then goes on to make a second poetic comment about the potentialities of the nerve system, the complexity of the human cortical computer. It is much more astonishing that not everybody remembers his or her previous death, and, because of this lack of remembering, most persons do not believe there was a previous death. But, likewise, they do not remember their recent birth, and yet they do not doubt that they were recently born. They forget that active memory is only a small part of our normal consciousness, and that our subconscious memory registers and preserves every past impression and experience which our waking mind fails to recall. The Lama then proceeds to slice directly to the esoteric meaning of the Bardo, that core meaning which Jung and indeed most European Orientalists have failed to grasp. For this reason, the Bardo, the Tibetan book vouchsafing liberation from the intermediate state between life and rebirth, which they men call death, has been couched in symbolical language. It is a book which is sealed with the 7 seals of silence, not because its knowledge would be misunderstood, and, therefore, would tend to mislead and harm those who are unfitted to receive it. But the time has come to break the seals of silence, for the human race has come to the juncture where it must decide whether to be content with the subjugation of the material world, or to strive after the conquest of the spiritual world, by subjugating selfish non-desires and transcending self-imposed limitations. The Lama next describes the effects of consciousness expansion techniques. He is talking here about the method. He knows the yogic, but his words are equally applicable to psychedelic experience. There are those who, in virtue of concentration and other yogic practices, are able to bring the subconscious into the realm of discriminative consciousness and, thereby, to draw upon the unrestricted treasury of subconscious memory, wherein are stored the records not only of our past lives, but the records of the past of our race, the past of humanity, and of all pre-human forms of life, if not of the very consciousness that makes life possible in this universe. If, through some trick of nature, the gates of an individual's subconsciousness were suddenly to spring open, the unprepared mind would be overwhelmed and crushed. Therefore, the gates of the subconscious are guarded by all initiate and hidden behind the veil of mysteries and symbols. In a later section of his foreword, the Lama presents a more detailed elaboration of the inner meaning of the Thodo. If the Bardo Thodo were to be regarded as being based merely upon folklore, or as consisting of religious speculation about death and a hypothetical after-death state, it would be of interest only to anthropologists and students of religion. But the Bardo Thodo is far more. It is a key to the innermost recesses of the human mind, and a guide for initiate and for those who are seeking the spiritual path of liberation. Although the Bardo Thodo is at present time widely used in Tibet as a breviary, and read or recited on the occasion of death, for which reason it has been aptly called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, one should not forget that it was originally conceived to serve as a guide not only for the dying and the dead, but for the living as well. And herein lies the justification for having made the Tibetan Book of the Dead accessible to a wider public. Notwithstanding the popular customs and beliefs which, under the influence of age-old traditions of pre-Buddhist origin, have grown around the profound revelations of the Bardo Thodo, it has value only for those who practice and realize its teaching during their lifetime. There are two things which have caused misunderstanding. One is that the teachings seem to be addressed to the dead or the dying, the other that the title contains the expression, liberation through hearing, in Tibetan, those droll. As a result, there has arisen the belief that it is sufficient to read or recite the Bardo Thodo in the presence of a dying person, or even of a person who has just died, in order to effect his or her liberation. Such misunderstanding could only have arisen among those who do not know that it is one of the oldest and most universal practices for the initiate to go through the experience of death before he can be spiritually reborn. Symbolically, he must die to his past and to his old ego before he can take his place in the new spiritual life into which he has been initiated. The dead or the dying person is addressed in the Bardo Thodo mainly for three reasons. 1. The earnest practitioners of these teachings should regard every moment of his or her life as if it were the last. 2. When a follower of these teachings is actually dying, he or she should be reminded of the experiences at the time of initiation, or of the words or mantra of the guru, especially if the dying one's mind lacks alertness during the critical moments. And 3. One who is still incarnate should try to surround the person dying, or just dead, with loving and helpful thoughts during the first 10 stages of the new, or after death, state of existence, without allowing emotional attachment to interfere or to give rise to a state of morbid mental depression. Accordingly, one function of the Bardo Thodo appears to be more to help those who have been left behind to adopt the right attitude towards the dead and towards the fact of death than to assist the dead who, according to Buddhist belief, will not deviate from their own karmic path. This proves that we have to do here with life itself and not merely with the mass for the dead, to which the Bardo Thodo was reduced in later times, under the guise of a science of death. The Bardo Thodo reveals the secret of life, and therein lies its spiritual value and its universal appeal. Is the key to a mystery which has been passed down for over 2,500 years, the consciousness expansion experience, the pre-MRTEN death and rebirth rite. The Vedic sages knew the secret, the Eleusinian initiate knew it, the Tantrics knew it. In all their esoteric writings they whisper the message: it is possible to cut beyond ego consciousness, to tune in on neurological processes which flash by at the speed of light, and to become aware of the enormous treasury of ancient racial knowledge welded into the nucleus of every cell in your body. Modern psychedelic chemicals provide a key to this forgotten realm of awareness. But just as this manual without the psychedelic awareness is nothing but an exercise in academic Tibetology, so, too, the potent chemical key is of little value without the guidance and the teachings. Westerners do not accept the existence of conscious processes for which they have no operational term. The attitude which is prevalent is, if you can't label it, and if it is beyond current notions of space-time and personality, then it is not open for investigation. Thus we see the ego loss experience confused with schizophrenia. Thus we see present-day psychiatrists solemnly pronouncing the psychedelic keys as psychosis-producing and dangerous. The new visionary chemicals in the pre-MORTE and death rebirth experience may be pushed once again into the shadows of history. Looking back, we remember that every Middle Eastern and European administrator, with the exception of certain periods in Greece and Persia, has, during the last 3,000 years, rushed to pass laws against any emerging transcendental process, the pre-MORTE and death rebirth session, its adepts, and any new method of consciousness expansion. The present moment in human history, as Lama Govinda points out, is critical. Now, for the first time, we possess the means of providing the enlightenment to any prepared volunteer. The enlightenment always comes, we remember, in the form of a new energy process, a physical, neurological event. For these reasons we have prepared the psychedelic version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This secret is released once again, in a new dialect, and we sit back quietly to observe whether man is ready to move ahead and to make use of the new tools provided by modern science. 2. The Tibetan Book of the Dead. First Bardo, the period of ego loss or non-game ecstasy, Chekhai Bardo 11 Part 1, the primary clear light scene at the moment of ego loss. All individuals who have received the practical teachings of this manual will, if the text be remembered, be set face to face with the ecstatic radiance and will win illumination instantaneously, without entering upon hallucinatory struggles and without further suffering on the age-long pathway of normal evolution which traverses the various worlds of game existence. This doctrine underlies the whole of the Tibetan model. Faith is the first step on the secret pathway. Then comes illumination, and with it certainty, and when the goal is won, emancipation. Success implies very unusual preparation and consciousness expansion, as well as much calm, compassionate game playing, good karma on the part of the participant. If the participant can be made to see into the empty mind as soon as he feels it, that is to say, he has the power consciously, and, at the supreme footing the ego, can recognize which will die him then. All game bonds of illusion are broken asunder immediately. The dream into reality simultaneously with the mighty achievement of recognition. It is best if the guru, spiritual teacher, from whom the participant received guiding instructions, is present, but if the guru cannot be another experienced person, or if the latter is also unavailable, then a person whom the participant trusts should be available to read this manual without imposing any of his own games. The participant will be put in mind of what he had previously heard and will at once come to recognize the fundamental light and undoubtedly obtain liberation. Liberation is the nerve system mental conception, realization of the void, the unbecome, the unborn, the unmade, the unformed, implies Buddhahood, perfect enlightenment, the state of the divine of the Buddha. It may be helpful to remember that this ancient doctrine is not in conflict with modern physics. The theoretical physicist and cosmologist George Gamow presented 1950 a viewpoint which is close to the phenomenological experience described by the Tibetan Lamas. In history, in time, we inevitably come to the epoch of that big squeeze with all the galaxies, stars, squeezed, so to speak, to a point during that matter must have created into its elementary components. Primordial mixture ILM. This first point, evolution of the present cycle, according to physicists, there exists the unborn, the unformed, and this, according to astrophysicists, is the way it will end, the silent unity of the unformed. The Tibetan Buddhists suggest that the uncluttered intellect can experience what astrophysics confirms. The Buddha Vajrayana, the Dhyani Buddha of the center, manifester of phenomena, highest path to enlightenment, as the source of organic life, in him all things visible have their consummation and absorption. He is associated with the central realm of the densely packed, i.e., the seed of all universal forces, and things are densely packed together. This remarkable convergence of astrophysics demands no complicated explanation. The logical awareness and awareness of every other natural process is there in the cortex. This mystical and measurement, but it's all there inside. You know to direct the process of it. Vision state, that is to say, when limited to words and ego games, is continuously active. The nerve state of quiet, but not active is to what Buddhists 12 call the highest state of dhyana, deep meditation when still united to a human body. The contemplation of the clear induces an ecstatic condition of consciousness, and mystics of the West have called. The first sign is the glimpsing of the clear of reality, the infallible mind of the state. This is the awareness transformations with no imposition of mental categories. The duration of this is with the individual. It depends on experience, security, trust, preparation, and the surroundings. I have had even a little practical experience of the tranquil gain awareness, and in those who have happy games, the state can last from 30 minutes to several hours. In this state, of what is called the ultimate truth is possible, provided that sufficient preparation has been made by the person, and otherwise he cannot benefit now, and drawn into lower and lower conditions of illusions, as determined by his past games, until he drops back to routine reality. It is important to remember that the conscious expansion process, the birth process, birth being the game life, and the ego loss experience being a temporary ending of game life. But in both there is a past state of consciousness into another. And just as an infant must wake up and learn from experience the nature of this world, so likewise, at the moment of consciousness expansion must wake up in this new world and become familiar with its own peculiar. In those who are heavily dependent on their ego games, and who up their control, the illuminated state endures only so long as it would take to snap a finger. In some, it lasts as long as the time taken for eating a meal. If the subject is to diagnose symptoms of ego loss, no help at this point. Not only should the person about to give up his ego be able to diagnose the symptoms as they come, but he should also be able to recognize the clear light being set face to face with it by another person. If the person fails to recognize the onset of ego loss, he may complain of strange bodily symptoms. This shows that he has reached a liberated state. Then the guide or friend should explain symptoms as indicating the onset of ego loss. There is a list of commonly reported physical sensations. 1. Bodily pressure, which sinking into water. 2. Is followed by fever, which is sinking into fire. 3. Body disintegrating or blown to atoms, called fire sinking into air. 4. Pressure on head and ears, which can rocket launching into space. 5. Tingling in extreme. 6. Flowing as if wax. 7. Nausea. 8. Aching, pelvic regions and spreading up torso. These physical reactions should be recognized as signs heralding transcendence. Avoid treating them as accept them, merge with them, enjoy them. Mild nausea occurs with the ingestion of Leary seeds or peyote, rarely with mescaline and frequently with LSD or psychedelic. If the 13 subject experience messages should be hailed as moving around in the body. The symptoms are mental. Mind controls the sensation. Should merge, experience it fully, enjoy it, and let consciousness flow on to the next phase. It's usually more natural to let consciousness stay. The subject's attention can concentrate on breathing, heartbeat. If this does not free him from nausea, the guide should move the consciousness to external events, music, walking in the garden, etc. The appearance of symptoms of ego loss, recognized and understood, should result in peaceful attainment of illumination. If ecstatic acceptance does not occur, or peaceful silence seems to, the relevant instructions can be spoken in a low voice in the ear. It is often useful to repeat them distinctly, clearly in person so as to prevent his mind from. Another method of guiding the experience with a minimum activity is to have the instructions previously recorded in the subject's own voice and to flip the tape on at the appropriate moment. Recall to the mind of the voyager former preparation. It will cause the naked consciousness to be clear light of the beginning, the subject of his unity with the stage of perfect enlightenment, help him to maintain it. It is familiar with this state. Previous experience and preparation, the wheel of rebirth, i.e., all gameplay is instantaneously is achieved, but such spiritual efficiency is so very rare that the normal mental condition of the person is unable to green feet of holding on to the state light shines, and there follows a progressive descent lower and lower states of the Bardo existence and rebirth. The simile of a needle balanced and is used by the lamas to achieve this condition. So long as the needle retains its balance, it remains on the eventually. The law of gravitation, the pole of the ego, external stimulation affects it. Clearly, the mentality of a person in the ego-transcendent state momentarily enjoys a condition of balance, of perfect, and of oneness. Unfamiliar with such a state, the next stage, the consciousness of the average human being lacks the power to function in a karmic, i.e., game. He's McLeod the consciousness principle with thoughts of personality, individualized dualism. Thus, losing equilibrium, consciousness falls away. It is thought process to prevent the real, which is the blowing out selfish game desire, and so the wheel of life continues to turn. For some appropriate passages, instructions may be read to the voyager during the period of waiting for it to take effect. When the first symptoms appear, when the voyager is clearly in a profound ego-transcendent, the wise guide remains silent. The secondary clear light scene immediately after. The preceding section of this graph, the clear light may be recognized and liberated. But if it becomes apparent that the primary clear light has not been recognized, then it can serve be assumed there is what is called the phase of the secondary clear light. The first flash of experience usually produces a state of greatest intensity. Every body is involved in orgastic creativity. It may be helpful to describe in more detail some of the phenomena which often accompany the ego loss. One of these might be called wave 14 flow. Becomes aware that he is part of a charged field of energy, which seems almost electrical. In order to maintain the ego lock as long as possible, the prepared person relax and allow forces to flow through him. There are two dangers to avoid. The attempt to energy flow. Either of these reactions is of ego, and the first attendance is lost. The second phenomenon might be called biological. Here he becomes aware of physiological and rhythmic pulsing activity within the body. Often this may be sensed as powerful motors or generators continuously throbbing and radiating energy. Flow of cellular forms and colors flashes by. Processes may also be heard with characteristic swooshing, crackling, and pounding noises. And must resist temptation to label or control these processes. At this point you are tuned into areas of the nerve system which are inaccessible to routine perception. Your ego into the molecular life. These processes are a billion years older than the learned conceptual mind. Another and most rewarding first Bardo involves ecstatic energy movement felt in the base of the backbone seems to in quiet concentration. The energy will be sensed as flowing upwards. Tantric adepts devote decades of concentrated meditation to the release of these ecstatic energies, which Kundalini power. One allows the energies to travel upwards through several ganglionic centers, chakras, to the brain, where they are sensed as a burning sensation in the top of the cranium. These sensations are not unpleasant to the prepared person, but, on the contrary, are accompanied by the most intense feelings of joy and illumination. Prepared subjects may interpret the experience in pathological terms to control it, usually with results. Professor R.C. is an Oriental scholar and expert on mysticism. No better, has published an account of how this prize experience and to hypochondriacal complaint in the I had a curious sense of the body me of what Mr. Eustace describes as a tingling at the base of the spine. According to him, usually precedes a bout of mania. In the broad walk the sensation occurred again and again until the climax of the experiment was reached. Did not like it at all. R.C.'s mysticism, sacred and profane. Oxford 19 p. 214 fails to recognize the rushing first Bardo liberation from the ego is lost. The person finds himself slipping back into mental activity. At this point he should try to recall or be reminded of them, and contact with these processes can be made. The second is less intense. A ball set reaches its grip at the first bounce. The second bounce is lower, and each succeeding bounce is still lower until the ball comes to rest. The bounce at the loss of similar to this. Its first spiritual bound, directly upon leaving the body ego, is the highest, the next is lower. The force of karma, i.e., past playing, takes over in different forms of external reality. Finally, the force of karma, having spent itself, consciousness returns to normal. Taken up again and thus first ecstasy usually ends with a momentary flashback to the ego condition. This return or sad, loving or fearful or 15 courageous, depending on the personality, the preparation, and the setting. This flashback to the ego game is accompanied by a concern with identity. Who am I now? Am I dead or not dead? What is happening? You can determine. You see the surroundings, companions, as you've been used to seeing. There is a penetrating sensitivity, but you are on a different level. Your ego grasps as sure as it was. The karmic hallucinations and visions have not yet. Neither the frightening apparitions nor heavenly visions have begun. This is sensitive and impregnated. The remainder of the experience can be pushed one way or another depending on the situation and emotional climate. If you are experienced in consciousness alteration, or if you are a natural situation, stay calm and let the experience take you where it will. You will probably experience the ecstasy of illumination again, or you may drift into aesthetic or philosophic or interpersonal enlightenments. Don't hold on. Let the stream carry you along. The person is usually beyond dependence. He can turn off external pressure and return to emotion. An extroverted person, upon social and outside situations may, however, become pleasantly distracted. Sounds. If you anticipate extroverted and if you want to maintain a non-game state of ecstasy, then remember the following suggestions. To be distracted, try to concentrate. Contemplative personage, e.g., Buddha, Socrates, Ramakrishna, Einstein, Hermann Hesse, or Lao Tzu. His model as if he were a being with a physical body waiting for you. Join him. If this is not successful, don't fret or think about it. Perhaps you don't have a mystical, transcendental ideal. That means conceptual limits are external games. Now that you know the mystic experience, you can prepare next time. Lost the content-free flow and should now be ready to slip into exciting confrontation with external reality. In the second video you can react deeply experience game revelations. We have just anticipated the reactions of the naturally mystical introvert, the experienced person, the extrovert. Now turn to the novitiate who shows confusion at this early stage of the sequence. The best procedure is to make a sign and do nothing. He will have read this manual, some guidepost. Leave him. He will probably go into his panic and master it. It indicates that he wishes guidance. Repeat instructions. And what is happening? Remind phase in the process. Urge him quietly to release his ego struggle and draw contact with clear light. Preparation and guidance of this sort will allow many to reach the illuminated state who would not be expected to recognize it. At this point, it is necessary to set the word of benign warning. Reading this manual is extremely useful, but no words can communicate experience. You are going to be surprised, startled, and delighted. A person may have heard a description of the art of swimming and yet never had the chance to swim. Suddenly, he finds himself unable to swim. So with those who have tried to learn the theory to experience ego loss and have never applied it, they maintain unbroken continuity of consciousness. They grow bewildered at the changed condition. They fail mystical activity. They fail of the opportunity unless upheld and directed by a guide. Even with all that a guide can do, they ordinarily, with bad karma, heavy ego games, fail to 16. But this is no cause for worry. At the worst, they just slip back to shore. No one has found, and most who have taken an eager to again. Even those who have familiar with the roadmaps and who previously may find themselves in settings where heavy behavior on the part of others forces them to contact with external reality. Recall the instructions. A person who masters this principle can block out the external. The one who has mastered control of consciousness is independent of setting. Again, who, although previously successful, may have brought games into the session with them, want to provide